I went to lunch with my wife's best friend, something I'd never done before. Not because I didn't like her, but because it was rare for us to have any kind of interaction without my wife present. This, however, was different. I had a plan. A beautiful, simple, romantic plan. I wanted to surprise the woman with whom I'd shared almost every dream of my life. I planned a trip she'd always dreamed of. I wanted to know about places she'd talked about with her best friend, because all I wanted was to see her happy, to see her smiling the way she had in the first months when it was just the two of us in the world. But everything fell apart that afternoon. Everything. When the waiter led us to our table, I glanced to the side, by chance, without looking for anything, without any expectations, and I saw it. I saw the unthinkable. I saw the kind of scene your brain takes a long time to process because you refuse to accept it's true. She was there. With another man. Laughing. With that light smile that used to be mine. With that lightness of someone who no longer hides anything because she's given herself completely. The world around me went silent, and for a few seconds I couldn't even breathe. My best friend continued talking, unnoticed. But I couldn't hear anything anymore. I froze. I stood up. My body moved before my brain could think. I crossed the room toward her table. She saw me on the way and went pale. Her face changed color, her eyes filled with panic. She knew. She knew there was no way to justify what I was about to see. When I reached the table, she only said my name, but I raised my hand and spoke first. Your reaction explains a lot. You don't even need to say anything. And I left. I didn't scream, I didn't cry, I didn't make a fuss. Her silence was the cruelest blow I've ever received. At home, I sat on our bed and stared into space. I grabbed a piece of paper and wrote. I explained that I knew, that I wasn't going to beg for explanations, that her betrayal had already shown me everything I needed to understand. I told her I was leaving and that I no longer wanted to be remembered by her as the man who forgives everything, but as the man who once loved her deeply and had the courage to walk away when there was no longer room for him. I folded the paper, left it on the table, grabbed my backpack, and left. Without looking back. She read the letter that night, and that's when everything fell apart. She broke down. Maybe she thought I'd stay, that I'd argue, that I'd fight with the other man. Maybe she expected a scene, slamming doors, screaming. But no. I just left. And it was my silence that destroyed her insides. The pain only reached her when she realized there was no going back. That I wouldn't text the next day. That I wouldn't come back to talk. That there wouldn't be enough tears in the world to erase that image I'd seen in that restaurant. And in that moment, for the first time, she understood that losing me was real. Desperate, she turned to the only person she knew could understand what had happened, her best friend. She asked why we'd gone out to lunch. She tried to understand why, on that day, of all days, I was with her. And the answer was the hardest blow of her life. She discovered I was planning a trip. That I wanted to surprise her. That I was trying so hard to listen to every detail of her dreams, to plan something that would be just ours. And she couldn't hold back the tears. She fell to the floor. Alone. Her hands trembling and her chest burning with regret. She understood that, while she was cheating on him, I loved her more than ever. That while she was feeding a lie, I was nourishing a dream. She tried to find me. She looked for me everywhere we used to be. She texted. She cried to mutual friends. She said she regretted it. That it was a mistake, that it meant nothing, that she wanted to get back together. But it was too late. I wasn't the same anymore. The pain shaped me, transformed me. I discovered that betrayal doesn't just destroy love. It kills trust, erodes the memory of good times, taints the past, and poisons the future. She understood this too late. Because by the time she decided to pursue me, months had already passed. And I was no longer alone. She found me by chance. In a cafe in the city where we used to go. But I wasn't there by chance. I'd come back to get something I'd left behind. A book. A souvenir. And she was there. She saw me from afar. And then her eyes froze. Like mine had froze in that restaurant. But now she was the spectator of the scene. Because I wasn't alone. I was accompanied. Holding hands. With a light smile. She was a woman. Simple. Serene. Who looked at me with admiration. She noticed. She understood. That what had once been hers alone was now someone else's. That complicity, that look of respect and love, was already elsewhere. And she did nothing. She just looked. And smiled in pain. Because she knew. She knew there was no going back. That no apology would erase that image. That no gesture would change what she had destroyed. Now she lives with the weight of what she lost. Because betrayal can be repaid. But sometimes, it's regret that returns. And that's the worst of visitors. Because it arrives too late. When the other person has already rebuilt their life, healed their wounds, and found love again. Today, she lives in silence. Alone. Looking at the photos of a past she herself destroyed. And I move on. Not with regret. But with the certainty that the love I gave wasn't in vain. It just wasn't for her. It was for someone who would know how to receive it with the same care I offered. Someone who would never make me feel invisible. Who wouldn't sit at the table with another man on the same day I was preparing a surprise. But there's still something you might not know, something no one noticed. A small detail, a hidden gesture, a silent choice made on the day of the betrayal, that changes the meaning of this entire story. A detail that will only be revealed at the right moment, when the past and the present collide for the last time. Welcome to the channel. Here, we do not support and never romanticize any type of betrayal. All the stories you hear are fictional, but based on situations extremely real. The objective is clear: show how betrayal destroys lives, trust and true love. Get ready. What you're about to hear, no, it's not just a story, it's a warning disguised as emotion. Take a deep breath, because this story will shock you. Thomas and Isabel met at an unlikely moment in their lives, in one of those intersections of routine and chance that feels more like a movie script. He, an architect with an introspective outlook, immersed in projects and models that always seemed to steal a glimpse of the real world from him. She, a literature teacher, passionate about romantic classics and the sound of rain beating on the windows in the early morning. Their encounter took place in a corner bookstore, where he was looking for a technical book and she was reorganizing a stack of novels left by students after a school project. Their exchange was shy, almost mechanical, but their glances told stories longer than any dialogue. Without realizing it, they had planted the seed of a relationship that would last more than a decade. They started slowly, without grandiose promises, but with gestures that, though small, seemed charged with meaning. Thomas always remembered to buy her favorite tea on Fridays, while Isabel made a point of hiding notes in his coat pockets during the winter. The house they decided to live in was simple but full of personality. Every piece of furniture hand-picked, every painting on the wall telling a story about them. Little by little, they shaped their home and, with it, a bond that seemed increasingly solid, almost unbreakable. Friends said they were the epitome of a couple who managed to balance freedom and complicity, laughter and silence, routine and passion. No one doubted their feelings for each other. Not even themselves. Life continued at a steady pace. Thomas prospered professionally, becoming a partner in a renowned architecture firm. Isabel, meanwhile, began coordinating literary projects in public schools and even published a collection of short stories that resonated well with niche readers. They didn't have children, a conscious choice, discussed leisurely, without pressure. They preferred to travel, enjoy time together, and experience life. From Paris to Cartagena, from the countryside to the beach, they collected memories in printed photographs and albums that sat scattered across the living room bookshelf, like testaments to a life well lived. There was an almost enviable harmony in the way they respected each other, how they recognized each other's limits and desires. Sometimes a glance, a pause in mid-speak, was enough for the other to understand exactly what was being said without words. Isabel had a best friend, Laura, who had been part of her life since college. The two were inseparable in their early years, confidants, soul sisters. Laura was there for them at their wedding, on their trips, and during their crises. And even as time and commitments became more intense, their bond remained strong. Thomas liked her. He found her intelligent and witty, and admired how much Laura cared for Isabel in times of stress or overwhelm. It was not uncommon for the two to go out for coffee or spend afternoons together exchanging confidences, and Thomas always encouraged this, understanding the value of maintaining bonds outside of marriage. He himself also had close friends, people with whom he shared his passion for photography and classical architecture. He was a reserved man, but intense with those he chose to keep close. Weekends were a separate chapter in their lives. They had a tradition: Saturday night was sacred. No matter the busy week, the tiredness, the obligations. There was always a special dinner, a carefully chosen song, sometimes a glass of wine, sometimes just laughter on the couch while watching something casual. It was in these moments that their intimacy was most genuine, not like a couple in love in a movie, but as partners who had chosen, day after day, to be together. There was mutual admiration, care, a desire to surprise. Isabel often wrote him letters, leaving them pinned to his closet door or under his pillow. Thomas, despite his practical nature, was also romantic. He knew exactly what to say at the right moments, and his silence was often more comforting than 1,000 words. Despite the beauty of their relationship, like any couple who share years of life, they also faced dark periods. Arguments over small things, disagreements about travel, timing, and choices. But they always knew how to find their way back. They had a silent pact not to go to bed angry, even when it required hours of late-night conversation or the discomfort of giving in. Respect, above all, was the foundation. And even when words failed, touch did the trick. It was as if each body knew exactly how to heal the other's pain. In these moments, the connection between them revealed itself even deeper, as if something invisible kept them stitched together by the soul. As the years passed, Thomas began to develop a desire that hadn't been so clear before: he wanted to start a family. It wasn't something that sprang from nowhere, but a desire that grew as he watched his friends become parents, as he observed the tired but fulfilled smiles of the people around him. He talked about it with Isabel, not as a demand, but as a sharing. She listened affectionately and reflected. He didn't reject it, but he didn't embrace it immediately either. He said he needed to think, that he had fears, that time seemed to pass too quickly. He understood. He didn't insist. But he kept it close to his heart like the seed of a new dream. It was in this context that he decided to do something special. Plan a different, memorable trip. A gesture of love, of reconnection. He wanted to take her to a place she'd never been, but always spoke about with a twinkle in her eyes. He thought of every detail, from the hotels with ocean views to the little surprises along the way. He decided he would do everything himself. He wanted it to be a genuine surprise. So he reached out to Laura. No one knew Isabel's desires as well as she did. He thought it would be beautiful to include her friend in this gesture. And Laura, as always, was willing, enthusiastic about the idea. They arranged to meet for lunch to talk more. It was a sunny, mild afternoon. Thomas was light-hearted and hopeful. He felt he was about to rekindle something that had never been extinguished but deserved a new flame. He wanted to show Isabel that, even after so long, he was still capable of surprising her, of making her heart race. The restaurant they chose was discreet, with outdoor seating and background music. He arrived first, ordered a drink, opened his notebook with his travel ideas, and waited for Laura. When she arrived, they smiled, exchanged a friendly hug, and began talking about everything that could make the trip unforgettable. At that moment, neither of them could have imagined that something was about to happen. Something that would forever change the dynamics of that triangle of trust and affection. Thomas suspected nothing. He was just a man in love, building dreams. Lara, too, seemed genuinely involved. There was truth in her eyes, excitement in her gestures. It was a plan of love, of surrender, of reconnection. Everything seemed right. Everything seemed aligned with what they believed about life and love. But the threads of life sometimes intertwine in unpredictable ways. And while Thomas detailed each idea of the trip with a twinkle in his eye, somewhere else in the city, something was unfolding without his knowledge. Something that, sooner or later, would surface, would come with the force of a wave, and would sweep away everything he thought was safe. But at that moment, none of that was visible. Just pure intentions, sincere smiles, and the anticipation of surprising someone he still considered the love of his life. Life sometimes prepares its twists and turns silently, and they arrive when least expected. And when they do, no one remains the same. But for now, there were only plans. A man, a friend, and a love that seemed unshakable. For now. Isabel was restless. It wasn't the kind of physical restlessness you notice in her body, her gait, or her tone of voice. It was something deeper, manifested in silences that stretched too far, in gazes that seemed lost even in the face of the landscapes she'd always loved. In recent days, she'd said she was tired, that she needed time for herself, that her classes at school were demanding more than usual. Thomas, understanding as always, offered her space without question. He knew Isabel was a complex, layered woman, and he never felt entitled to intrude on anything she didn't wish to share. He believed in time as an ally of love, and he hoped that, at some point, she would return to being that wordy woman who enchanted him with reflections on Virginia Woolf or Clarice Lispector over breakfast. Meanwhile, he remained focused on planning the trip, on the details that would make this gift memorable. It was his way of staying close, even as he felt her slowly drifting away. Lara understood, too. Conversations with her friend had become shallower, less spontaneous. Isabel, who once shared everything, from her daydreams to her most intimate fears, now slipped between rehearsed phrases and mechanical smiles. Lara tried to insist a few times, asking what was going on, but the answer always came with evasions. And, "It's okay," that almost seemed like a plea not to insist any further. There was, indeed, something behind that distance, something Lara preferred not to name, perhaps for fear of what she would find if she dug too deeply. Thomas, on the other hand, continued with his plans, ignoring the subtle signs, perhaps out of love, perhaps out of blind faith that everything was just a moment of passing turbulence. At school, Isabel maintained her appearance. She kept to her schedule, smiled at her students, and corrected essays with the same dedication as always. But when she got home, silence became her refuge again. At night, she said she was tired and went to bed earlier. Thomas respected this. On some of those nights, he slept with a slight discomfort in his chest, an inexplicable feeling that something was slipping through his fingers, even when he believed he was doing everything right. He woke early the next day, lovingly made coffee, left sweet messages on her phone, and headed to work, trying to dispel the shadow slowly growing within him. Lunch with Lara had taken place just a few days earlier. She had offered valuable suggestions about the places Isabel had always dreamed of visiting. They talked about Tuscany, the Granada Poetry Festival, and small bookshops in villages that seemed to have come straight out of old novels. Thomas wrote it all down, smiled, and felt excited. When he returned home that night, he tried to share some of his excitement with Isabel, without revealing the plan, of course. He talked about flights, about random destinations, disguising his intentions. But she reacted coolly, saying it might be best to postpone travel for a while, that there was too much going on. Thomas didn't insist. He just looked at her tenderly and said he understood. But he didn't give up. He wanted to make this happen. He needed to. The next afternoon, Isabel left work early. She said she had something to do downtown and then she'd stop by the bookstore to pick up an old order. Thomas took the opportunity to review reservations, confirm dates, and adjust some itineraries. He was excited, even though he didn't fully understand the distance. He believed that, once she'd been surprised, she'd open up again. That they'd laugh together again like before. That her eyes would light up again when they met his. That night, they had dinner in silence. He talked about a new exhibition he wanted to see with her. Isabel nodded but seemed distant, her mind elsewhere. She went to her room before him and said she was exhausted. Thomas, sitting at the table, stared into his wine glass. He felt an emptiness he couldn't explain. Something was wrong, but he couldn't put his finger on it. In the following days, Isabel began going out more frequently. She said she felt trapped at home, that she needed to clear her head. He started inventing school events, meetings that went on longer than usual. He started arriving late, with vague excuses. Sometimes I didn't even eat dinner. Thomas, though confused, didn't ask direct questions. He didn't want to appear controlling. He never did. He respected her freedom above all else. But he began to notice. The clothes she chose, the different perfumes, the rush to put away her cell phone, the overly long showers upon returning home. The feeling that had previously been merely an annoyance began to take on more defined contours. And it slowly gnawed at him. Lara noticed. She called Thomas one night and asked if everything was okay. He hesitated, but finally opened up, without accusing Isabel of anything, just saying she was different, distant, cold. Lara tried to soften the situation, saying it could be stress, that maybe it was just a phase. But deep down, she already knew. She'd noticed signs in her friend's gestures, in the way she'd been talking about Thomas lately, always with a certain hidden irritation. She tried to talk to Isabel, but she deflected, changed the subject, said she didn't want to talk about it. And then Lara started to really worry. Thomas, unsure of what else to do, decided to go ahead with the trip. He wanted the surprise to be a fresh start. He chose the date of their wedding anniversary, booked everything, and prepared a short presentation with pictures of the places, quotes from authors Isabel loved, and songs that marked their memories. He was nervous, but hopeful. That Saturday morning, he woke up early, made her favorite breakfast, and asked her to take the day off. He said he had a surprise. Isabel seemed disconcerted, but smiled slightly. She said she needed to leave quickly and would be back by lunch. Thomas agreed, even though he found it strange. She hurried off without looking back. Hours later, he received a message from Lara asking if they could have lunch together. She wanted to discuss something important. They met at a discreet restaurant. Thomas arrived first, as always. He had the travel envelope in his pocket. While he waited, he watched the couples around him, trying not to overthink. Lara arrived with a serious expression. She sat down and ordered only a water. She began speaking slowly, as if measuring each word so as not to hurt more than necessary. But before he could say what he wanted, Thomas looked away, by chance, instinctively, and froze. A few feet away, sitting across from another man, was Isabel. There was no doubt. It was her. The smile, the way she tossed her hair to the side, the way she rested her chin on her hand as she listened. And him. An unknown man, touching her arm intimately, laughing knowingly. Thomas heard nothing else. The sound of the restaurant faded. The whole world stopped for a few seconds. Slowly, he stood up. His body felt heavy, his feet as stiff as stone. Lara called to him, tried to hold him, but he didn't listen. He walked toward the table, unsure of what to do. Each step seemed like an eternity. When Isabel saw him, her eyes widened. Her face drained of color. The man beside her also looked confused. Thomas said nothing. He stopped in front of her and, looking into her eyes, simply said, "Your reaction explains a lot." You don't even need to say anything. Then he turned and left, without waiting for an answer, without giving any room for explanations. He returned home in silence. His stomach churned, his heart tightened, his eyes dry. He sat at the table, took the envelope from his pocket, and stared at it for a few minutes. Then he opened the drawer, took out a pen and paper, and wrote. Each word weighed like a stone. He allowed himself no emotion. Only facts. When he finished, he folded the sheet, left it on the table, and packed his suitcase. He left home with the calm of someone who knows that love sometimes dies silently. Meanwhile, across town, Isabel finished explaining to her lover that she needed to leave. It had been a mistake, she said. A mix-up. But the words felt empty. She picked up her cell phone and tried calling Thomas. No answer. She sent messages. Nothing. She returned home late that afternoon and found the letter. She read it in silence, her eyes filling with tears. She felt a lump in her throat, a heaviness in her chest. She tried calling again. Silence. That night, lying alone in bed, Isabel finally understood what she had lost. But she still didn't know everything. There was still something hidden beneath the surface. Something she never imagined. Something that would completely change the meaning of that betrayal, and everything that would come after. Isabel spent the next few days as if walking on quicksand. Guilt throbbed in her chest, a hole that not even silence could fill. She called, wrote, begged for answers that never came. Thomas's absence was more deafening than any scream, more cutting than any confrontation. Not knowing where he was consumed her, but more than that, knowing he had left without a fuss, without harsh words, made her realize that perhaps the love she thought eternal no longer belonged to her. Memories came in waves. The plans, the gestures, the letters left under her pillow, the glances she herself had begun to ignore. She felt the bitter taste of the choice she had made in silence, a choice that now seemed absurd, insane, unforgivable. Lara, upon hearing what had happened, went to her. They were in the apartment. The living room felt colder, as if Thomas's absence had also taken the soul of the house. Isabel curled up on the sofa and stared at her friend with devastated eyes. She said through sobs that she had destroyed everything, that she didn't know why, that perhaps she had lost her mind out of fear of routine, out of impulse, out of vanity. Lara remained standing, motionless for a few moments. And then, with a firm tone Isabel had rarely heard, she asked why she had gotten involved with that man. Isabel stammered, spoke of neediness, of insecurity, of the illusion of feeling desired again. But when she looked at Lara and saw something different in her eyes, something harder than judgment, she realized there was more to that question. There was hurt. And that frightened her. Lara sighed deeply, turned away for a moment, and then said something that shattered the air in the room. She said that years ago, even before Thomas and Isabel were married, she had been engaged to that man. It didn't last long, but it was intense. And he was the one who abandoned her without explanation, without warning, simply disappearing from her life with broken promises and a ring returned in the mail. She said it took her years to recover, to rebuild herself, to be able to trust any man again. And when she discovered, through social media, that Isabel was seeing him, her world turned around again. She never commented, never confronted him, because she didn't want to believe it. She thought it was a coincidence, that maybe it was someone with the same name, the same face, the same voice. But when she saw him at the restaurant, everything became clear. It became even clearer when Isabel fell silent at that revelation. Her silence said it all. Lara no longer needed confirmation. The room fell silent. Isabel felt her face burn, her hands tremble. She tried to justify herself, trying to explain that she didn't know the story, that she never knew about their past. But Lara didn't believe her. She said they had talked about him countless times in the past, that she knew his name, his face, the details. He said he couldn't accept that it was just a coincidence. To her, Isabel had made a conscious choice, even if unconscious. A choice that hurt in all the right places to cause maximum destruction. And maybe, deep down, it was true. Isabel began to cry, a stifled, desperate cry, of someone who realizes they've hurt more than they can bear. Lara then stood up. She said she could no longer be that present friend, accomplice, confidant. That she now understood what Thomas felt. She said perhaps he had discovered more than he seemed, more than the betrayal. And she left a hint that Isabel didn't immediately understand. When she asked what she meant by that, Lara hesitated. She lowered her eyes, walked to the door, and said simply that she would have to find out for herself. She left, slamming the door behind her. Isabel was left alone. And in that silence, something began to germinate. A doubt. A distrust that would linger for the next few days like a shadow. She went through every message, every piece of paper Thomas had left. He tried calling friends and family, but no one knew for sure where he was. A mutual friend said he might have gone to visit relatives in another state, but no one was sure. Isabel, increasingly restless, decided she had to find him. She knew she couldn't undo what she'd done, but she needed to look him in the eye, tell him she'd made a mistake, that she'd lost her way, that she'd traded the essential for the trivial. He drove around and chased clues, visited places he used to go, called hotels they knew he liked. Nothing. Until, one afternoon, she logged back into his professional profile and found a photo that hadn't been there before. It was a simple image, yet loaded with meaning. Thomas was smiling, standing in front of a small bookstore, hand in hand with a woman. His smile was serene, light, the same smile she hadn't seen in months. Isabel's heart sank. She recognized the bookstore's facade. She knew where it was. And in that instant, she knew he had moved on. That while she wallowed in regret, he had found elsewhere the peace she had destroyed. The pain was excruciating. But there was something more in that photo. The woman beside Thomas had a familiar face. She enlarged the image, looked again. It took a few seconds for it to sink in. And then, everything spun. The world collapsed like a house of cards. It was her. Someone Isabel had known for a long time. Someone she had silently despised, out of envy, insecurity, comparison. Someone who, ironically, now occupied the place that had once been hers. Unsure of what to do, she drove to the town where the bookstore was located. She needed to see him. She needed, even from afar, to confirm what she saw in those photos. She arrived late in the afternoon. She parked and got out of the car on shaky legs. And there he was, walking hand in hand with his wife. They stopped in front of a flower stand. Thomas bought a small bouquet and handed it to her with a kiss on the cheek. Isabel didn't approach. She just watched, her heart breaking. When he turned, as if by instinct, their eyes met. He saw her. He was serious for a second, then smiled slightly. There was no anger, no surprise. Just a serene look, as if he had already expected this reunion. Isabel froze. Thomas approached slowly, excused himself from the woman accompanying him, and walked over to her. He didn't ask what she was doing there. He simply said he was fine, that he was rebuilding his life, and that he hoped she could do the same. Isabel tried to speak, but the words wouldn't come out. Then, weakly, she asked if he'd been with her for a long time. Thomas nodded. He said it was unexpected, but inevitable. That he found in her the care, the respect, the admiration he hadn't felt in a long time. Isabel nodded silently. And then, in a desperate impulse, he asked if he knew who the man she cheated on him with was. Thomas was silent for a moment. Then he answered with surprising firmness. He said he knew, and that was precisely what made him leave without looking back. Because in that man, he saw everything she had once despised. And in that gesture, he understood that their love had ended long before the betrayal. It just took him a while to realize it. Isabel, devastated, asked if there was any chance, any remnant, any room for forgiveness. Thomas looked into her eyes. He said he forgave her, yes. That he no longer held any resentment. But forgiveness doesn't mean returning. He said he now understood how much he had sacrificed himself for years trying to keep her happy, while she looked outward as if something were always missing. He said what he felt now wasn't revenge, nor anger, but freedom. And that she needed to find her own path, without relying on other people's guilt. Isabel didn't insist. She knew this was the end. But before he left, Thomas paused. He looked at her with a deep, almost sad look, and revealed something she never imagined hearing. He said that on the day of lunch with Lara, before everything happened, he had stopped at a jewelry store. He took a small case from his pocket and showed her the ring. He said he planned to propose to her as a vow renewal during the trip he had planned. That despite everything, he still believed they could build something more, go beyond the routine, beyond the doubts. Isabel burst into tears. It was more than she could bear. Thomas said goodbye with a kiss on the forehead, as if closing a chapter. He returned to the woman who now filled his present. Isabel stood there for minutes, unsure of how to proceed. But something inside her knew this was the point of no return. And that now, more than ever, she was alone with the weight of the choices she'd made. Unaware yet that there was one more detail about to emerge. A detail that would put everything into new perspective. That same night, Isabel drove home as if driving in a trance. The streetlights passed by her like shadows of painful memories, and everything around her seemed strange, as if the world were no longer the same. And in a suit, it wasn't. The image of Thomas holding another hand, the delicate gesture with the bouquet, the light kiss on that woman's cheek, the serene gaze with which he stared at her, all of it now haunted her like a broken mirror reflecting what she had lost. The tears no longer came with fury, but with a resigned weight. They were no longer tears of guilt, but of recognition. Of the bitter realization that there was nothing left to do, that all the bridges were not only destroyed, but wiped off the map. The silence inside the car was the same that occupied her heart now, a void where once there had been plans, laughter, and presence. Arriving home, she found the living room as she had left it days before. Nothing had moved, nothing had changed, and yet, everything was different. She took off her shoes, walked to the kitchen, opened a bottle of wine, and poured herself a sip that went down with a sting. She sat on the sofa and stared at the wall for several long minutes. Then she got up, went to the bedroom, and pulled an old box from the back of the closet. Inside were letters, photographs, movie tickets, birthday notes. Printed memories of a love that, though alive in records, was now dead in reality. She read one of the letters Thomas had written years before. His words had a special glow, a warmth that now sounded like an echo of a world she herself had destroyed. She felt small in the face of this man's generosity. And it was at that moment that she felt something snap inside. It wasn't just remorse, it was the shame of having spurned something many people would spend a lifetime searching for. Days passed. Time, indifferent, continued its course. Isabel returned to work, trying to regain some semblance of normalcy, but it was clear something was broken. Her colleagues noticed her distance, but didn't ask questions. The only person who still dared to offer words of comfort was an older student, who left her little notes with poems scribbled on notebook paper. It was in these loose words that she found some solace. And it was in one of these notes, with a verse by Neruda about what is lost when you love wrongly, that she had a moment of inspiration. He picked up his cell phone and decided to try to reach Lara. He needed answers. I needed to know something I still didn't understand. He called once, twice, 3 times. No answer. He sent messages. Days later, he received a brief reply, if you still want to talk, meet me at the coffee shop on the corner at 6 p.m. Today only. Isabel arrived early. She sat at a table in the back, choosing the most hidden seat. When Lara arrived, her gaze was direct, unblinking. She sat down without greeting. She simply ordered a coffee and crossed her arms. The silence between them was piercing. Isabel took a deep breath, swallowed her anxiety, and got straight to the point. She wanted to know what Lara had meant that day when she said Thomas knew more than he let on. Lara hesitated. She looked to the side, then down. And then, with a coldness that seemed studied, she said that perhaps it was time for Isabel to know what really happened before the end. Isabel remained silent, waiting. And that was when Lara revealed the cruelest part of the story. She said that the week before her lunch with Thomas, he had reached out to her again. He had noticed changes in Isabel's behavior and that, although he didn't want to be suspicious, he sensed something was wrong. Lara remained silent at that moment, didn't tell him everything, but began to observe her friend with new eyes. When Thomas invited her to lunch, she went with a dual purpose, to help him with the trip and, at the same time, to understand if what he feared was real. She said that during lunch, she realized he was fragile, but hopeful. That he wasn't sure of anything, and precisely for that reason, she wanted to get closer, to rekindle their bond. And that it was only after lunch that she, on impulse, followed Isabel to a restaurant, for no clear reason, perhaps driven by an unconscious suspicion. And it was there that she saw with her own eyes, Isabel and the man she knew well, sitting together, smiling intimately. She was breathless. And it was there, that very afternoon, that Lara made the decision not to tell Thomas. Not then. Not then. She wanted to spare him. I wanted to let him discover it his own way. Isabel could hear everything without being able to move. And then she asked, her voice trembling, if he really knew. If Thomas knew who that man was. Lara nodded. He said he recognized him immediately, but that he hadn't revealed everything to Thomas. That he'd seen it with his own eyes, and that was enough. But what Isabel didn't know, what no one knew, was that Thomas, upon recognizing the man, remembered something even more painful. Something he'd shared with no one except an old diary. An ancient trauma. A connection with this man that went far beyond a simple rival. A buried pain that now resurfaced like an open wound. The conversation was interrupted by a message on Lara's cell phone. A reminder of an appointment. She stood, packed her bag, and said, before leaving, that Isabel needed to accept that some losses cannot be repaired. That her true punishment would be to forever carry the weight of knowing that the love she destroyed could never be replaced. Isabel didn't respond. He just watched as Lara walked out the door, leaving behind a woman stripped of all the certainties she once held. That night, lying alone, Isabel began to piece together the puzzle she'd ignored for years. She remembered a time long ago, months before the wedding, when Thomas briefly mentioned a painful episode from his youth. He spoke of a friendship that ended in betrayal, of a longtime partner who had passed him by on an important project, of a feeling of having been used and discarded. He didn't name names, didn't elaborate, simply saying that he had learned to never again blindly trust someone who appears smiling when the door is ajar. And that's when it all made sense. The man she'd become involved with, the man she'd chosen in her weakest moments, was the same man who, years earlier, had betrayed Thomas at a defining moment in his life. And she, unknowingly, had reenacted his worst nightmare. But now it was too late. Too late for regrets, too late for amends. In the following days, Isabel tried to reconnect with Thomas. Not to ask for his return, but to clearly apologize. She wanted to at least acknowledge him as someone who deserved much more than she was capable of offering. She wanted him to know that she finally understood the depth of the love he gave and the depth of the mistake she made. But he didn't respond. A mutual friend told her that Thomas had moved away, starting a new life in another city. That he was well, happy, and serene. Isabel then decided to write one last letter. Not as an attempt at reconciliation, but as a gesture of respect. She put everything there, every thought, every pain, every regret. She left it in trustworthy hands, hoping that one day he would read it. Months passed. Routine returned, but Isabel was no longer the same. She learned, through pain, that love is a construction made of details, of loyalty, of silent choices that shape the present and prepare the future. She learned that you don't always lose everything at once. Sometimes, what's lost disappears in small, invisible pieces, until nothing remains but the echo of what could have been. Time ran its course, as it always does. And Isabel now carries a scar that cannot be seen, but that bleeds on quieter nights. Because sometimes, the true punishment isn't being left behind. It's looking forward and realizing that the one left behind was you. The silence that fell after Isabel's last gesture, the letter delivered by a third party, written with the sincerity that only pain can produce, became part of her new routine. There was no expectation of a response, nor any hope of some outcome that would alleviate the guilt. The only thing she carried now was the certainty that, no matter what came, there was something in her that would never be the same again. He walked the streets with his shoulders slightly hunched, as if carrying on his shoulders the invisible weight of all the wrong choices he'd made, and it was no longer an attempt to repair or remedy, but to accept, with humility, that some falls leave scars that no subsequent good intentions can erase. That guilt didn't destroy her furiously, but it gnawed at her steadily, like water seeping through the cracks in concrete and weakening it until it cracks from within. At times, she considered moving to a new city, starting over, reinventing herself. But something always kept her there, as if she needed to live daily with the echoes of the places they'd shared, the scents, the music, the cafes, the street corners that held ghosts of a true love she'd spurned when she'd had it. She began frequenting a bookstore near her home, not as an escape, but as a ritual. She'd sit in the back, among the silent shelves, and leaf through poetry books as if each verse could mend what her heart was letting slip through her fingers. Sometimes, she'd write short passages in an aging notebook. Passages about absence, about loss, about the absurdity of getting used to the absence of someone who's still alive, but no longer with you. Weekends became the most difficult times. Before, they were full of life, plans, and silent complicity. Now, they were long and slow, like a wait that never ends. Isabel realized that loneliness wasn't just the absence of company, but the constant confrontation with her own regret. And there was something more, a dilemma that arose at the most unexpected moments. Did he deserve to move on? Was it permissible to dream of a new chance at happiness, even after everything he'd done? The answer wasn't clear. Sometimes, she believed that yes, that everyone makes mistakes and that everyone has the right to start over. Other times, she believed that life's greatest lesson would be accepting that some pains are irreparable, that love isn't an unbreakable promise, but a fragile construction, made of choices that must be respected every day. Meanwhile, Thomas's life continued far from her sight. She learned from an acquaintance that he had established himself as a freelance architect in a coastal town, that he was building his own uniquely designed home, surrounded by nature, minimalist and functional. She also learned that he had adopted a dog, something he had always wanted but never done together. And, more than that, that he seemed happy, not with an exuberant happiness, but the kind that comes from within, of someone who sleeps peacefully with the choices they've made. There was also the woman he appeared with on social media, discreet, with a sincere smile, someone who apparently knew his pain but loved him gently, without demanding more than he could give. Isabel never tried to dig into details. She preferred to maintain the image that he was fine, as a way of accepting that, at least, he had escaped the storm with some dignity. It was one of those days, while walking alone through a park, that a simple gesture interrupted her mechanical routine. An elderly man, sitting on a bench with a book in his hands, offered a gentle smile and commented on the poem he was reading. It was an excerpt from Emily Dickinson, one of those poems that speak of eternity in a few words. They began to talk. It wasn't a deep conversation, but it was enough for Isabel to remember what it felt like to be seen with kindness, without judgment. She met him again. She discovered he was a widower, a retired history professor, and that he used to go to the park daily as a way to keep alive the memory of the wife he had lost years before. Their conversations became part of Isabel's week. There was no romantic intention, just two strangers sharing meaningful silences. And, little by little, she began to feel that there was a life that could still be lived, even if it wasn't the one she had originally dreamed of. Meanwhile, unexpected news reached her through an old friend. The man with whom she had betrayed her had been arrested for involvement in a tax fraud scheme. The news was accompanied by scandal, headlines in local newspapers, and investigations that had dragged on for years, finally coming to light. Isabel was shocked, but not for him. She no longer felt anything toward that man, but rather for realizing that, even when everything seemed to have collapsed, there were still consequences to come, pieces moving on a board she thought was closed. Once again, she felt ashamed, not for him, but for allowing someone like that to cross the line in her life. And more than that, for having allowed her weakness to hand her heart over to someone unworthy, while the one who truly loved her was left on the sidelines. It was only then, for the first time in a long time, that Isabel felt able to write not about loss, but about forgiveness, not what she expected from Thomas, but what she needed to give herself. She wrote a letter she would never deliver, where she allowed herself to say everything she had never said out loud, that she was not a victim, that there were no apologies, but that there was still room to rebuild something within herself. She understood that she didn't need to wait for definitive punishment, nor to self-sabotage forever. It was possible to acknowledge the mistake, learn from it, and move on, not as someone who forgets, but as someone who chooses to grow. A few months later, while organizing books on one of the school shelves, Isabel found an old letter tucked between the pages of a novel she used to assign to the more sensitive students. It was a letter written by a student years ago, thanking her for awakening in him a love of literature. She remembered the boy, shy, withdrawn, with difficulty expressing himself, and how he had blossomed by writing his own stories. She smiled to herself. For the first time in a long time, she felt she could still be a light to someone, even if she was shrouded in shadow. That night, he walked home with his shoulders less heavy. The guilt was still there, but now it was no longer an anchor, it was a memory, like a scar that sometimes stings but no longer bleeds. Meanwhile, in another part of the world, Thomas watched the sea in silence, sitting on the porch of the house he built with his own hands. He had someone by his side who respected his silences and celebrated his smiles. Sometimes I still thought of Isabel, not with anger, nor with longing, but with a kind of bitter gratitude. After all, it was at the very moment everything fell apart that he found the freedom he never knew he needed. And, more than that, he found himself, no longer trying to be what others expected, no longer losing himself trying to hold together what had been falling apart for so long. Time doesn't erase everything. But it does teach. And, in that moment, what life taught them both was that love and loyalty are daily choices, and that their absence exacts a heavy price. A price that, in some cases, isn't paid with tears, but with the simple, devastating silence of those who never return. The world kept turning, indifferent to human pain, but within each of them, a new cycle began. A more mature, more attentive cycle, where mistakes wouldn't be forgotten, but would serve as a guide to never again lose sight of what truly matters. Because, in the end, the true moral dilemma of those who betray isn't being forgiven, it's being able to forgive themselves and, even so, carrying the weight of knowing that the best of themselves no longer belongs to anyone. Autumn was advancing, and the dry leaves covering the sidewalk seemed to announce a definitive cycle of closure. Isabel was beginning to understand that the process of rebuilding wasn't done in a hurry, nor with romantic expectations of redemption. Her routine was now marked by small rituals, waking up early, making her own coffee more carefully, walking around the square on Mondays, reviewing tests more carefully than before. She had discovered that silence could be fertile ground, not only for pain, but also for self-analysis. It was no longer about looking back with regret, but about looking inward and understanding the labyrinths that had led her to the depths of herself. She began to write frequently, not as an escape, but as a confession. On anonymous pages of a bound notebook, she poured out feelings that had previously suffocated her, guilt, yes, but also accumulated frustrations, unspoken desires, resentments buried under years of trying to be the ideal woman. One afternoon, after a pedagogical meeting that dragged on longer than necessary, she was approached by a new colleague, Miguel, an art teacher. He was reserved but curious, with a way of listening that disarmed her. They exchanged a few words about a cultural project at school, and he mentioned that he'd been reading her old articles on contemporary literature. Isabel was surprised, no one had mentioned those texts in years. It awakened a dormant memory, the pleasure of being recognized for what she thought, not just by those she loved or disappointed. Over time, their encounters became frequent. First, for professional reasons. Then, by coincidence. And then, as happens when two people are wounded but open, a tenuous connection began to emerge, built slowly, without promises, only with the sincerity of someone who has suffered enough to no longer pretend. At one of these meetings, during a cultural event organized by the students, Miguel noticed the weariness in Isabel's eyes and asked a direct question, one of those questions that are uncomfortable because of how deeply they cut. Have you forgiven yourself yet? She swallowed hard. She tried to smile, but couldn't. She simply said she didn't know how yet. Miguel didn't press. He simply said that self-forgiveness isn't a sudden gesture, but a process that begins when you stop treating yourself as someone who doesn't deserve happiness. And it was on that day that Isabel realized that, for the first time in a long time, she wasn't alone. Not in the superficial sense of companionship, but in the real sense of being seen, understood, and welcomed without judgment. The following weeks were filled with internal discoveries. Isabel began to question why she had gotten to where she was, why she had allowed her life to be guided by external expectations, by a constant search for validation. She understood that the betrayal wasn't just against Thomas, but against herself, against the woman she once dreamed of being, who was stifled by insecurities she'd never faced. She began therapy. In her first few sessions, she felt out of place, ashamed, as if she didn't have the right to seek help. But little by little, the words began to flow. She cried when she realized she'd carried a distorted self-image since her youth. She cried even more when she realized that, out of fear of abandonment, she was the one who had first abandoned everything solid, stable, and true. She no longer sought excuses. She sought understanding. Meanwhile, Thomas's figure remained present, not as a shadow, but as a symbol. He didn't respond to messages, and Isabel respected that. But one night, while reviewing old videos on her phone, she found a short recording he'd made on a random day during a stroll through his favorite bookstore. He smiled at the camera, showed a book, and said, "This one's just like us." A little dramatic, but full of truth. That simple, unpretentious video completely disarmed her. Because there he was, whole, available, naive in his giving. And she had let this man go without a fight, without understanding the value of what she held in her hands. But now, for the first time, she could see the story with the clarity of someone no longer shielding themselves behind excuses. It was then that a new, unexpected situation arose. On a casual visit to the neighborhood bookstore, Isabel ran into the woman who stood next to Thomas in the photograph from that afternoon. There was no way she couldn't recognize her, her face was unforgettable. She considered walking away, slipping away unnoticed. But before she could retreat, the woman approached with a polite, cordial smile. She said she knew who she was. She said she wasn't there for confrontation, nor for difficult conversations. But, in a calm tone, she said something that dismantled Isabel's defenses. She told her that Thomas, even after everything, had never spoken ill of her. That he had always described her as an intelligent, intense woman, and that, despite the mistake, he believed she was better than that moment when he lost himself. Isabel froze. She didn't know what to say. The woman then added, "He chose to move on. Not to forget you, but to not forget himself." Isabel returned home that day with a strange feeling, not pain, not relief, but something closer to acceptance. Life doesn't give back what's lost, but sometimes it offers tools to build something new with what's left. And there, deep within that new awareness, a desire was born, to do things differently. Not to prove anything to anyone, but to honor what she'd learned from her mistakes. She decided, then, to accept Miguel's invitation to a lecture he was giving in another city. They went together, chatting along the way about everything, music, politics, books. For the first time, Isabel spoke openly about her experience. She didn't hold anything back. Miguel listened attentively, without interrupting, and in the end, he simply said, "The past doesn't define who you are. What defines you is what you decide to do with it." After that, the two grew even closer. But Isabel was in no rush. And neither was Miguel. It was a bond built carefully, without pressure. One day, sitting on a bench in the square where they always talked, Miguel said he had bought tickets to a literary festival in the south and asked if she would like to go with him. Isabel smiled, hesitated, and replied that she needed to think. Not out of fear, but out of respect for what she was feeling. That night, she wrote in her notebook, "For the first time in years, I'm afraid to be happy. But maybe that's exactly why I should try." And, even as she began again with cautious steps, Thomas walked through other scenarios, now increasingly distant from the memories that held him captive. The new life he built didn't erase what he'd experienced with Isabel, but it did place him in a place where it no longer hurt. It was a memory he carried like someone carrying a scar. It doesn't disappear, but it doesn't prevent him from embracing new possibilities. His new relationship was light, genuine. There wasn't the explosive intensity of the past, but there was calm, partnership, respect. And that was what he needed. Thomas learned that love isn't just what burns and consumes, sometimes, it's what embraces and sustains. Life went on. And in this constant flow of new beginnings and resignations, Isabel began to understand that true love isn't measured solely by what one feels, but by what one builds, day after day. She understood that trust is a delicate thread, and that once broken, even if it's rebuilt, it will never be the same. But she also understood that pain doesn't have to be an end. It can be a beginning. A new kind of love, with herself, with the world, with those who cross her path with generosity, not games. She didn't know what lay ahead. But now, at least, she walked without fear of looking within. And perhaps, in the end, that was what mattered most. Because some stories end with happy endings. Others, with fair endings. And still others, like hers, that don't end, they just transform, and continue. It was on a spring afternoon, almost a year after everything had fallen apart, that Isabel finally decided to visit the modern art exhibition Miguel had praised so much. She arrived alone, wearing a light dress and a serene look. The museum entrance was lined with families, couples, and young people distracted by their cell phones. She walked among the people as if she had relearned how to breathe, as if she understood that living with the weight of pain doesn't mean carrying the guilt forever. The paintings, full of distorted shapes and bold colors, reflected her inner journey well. Nothing was more perfectly aligned, and yet there was beauty in imperfection. He stopped before a metal sculpture depicting two intertwined bodies drifting apart. He smiled lightly. There, in that silent piece, he saw portrayed everything she had experienced with Thomas, an intense love that ended not for lack of feeling, but for lack of care, of truth, of presence. Miguel arrived minutes later. He wore a light blue shirt, smiled naturally, and carried 2 coffees in his hands. He didn't ask anything. He simply stood beside her and observed the same sculpture in silence. Between them, there was a mutual respect, built with patience and sincerity. Over time, they became more than colleagues, more than friends. It was a relationship made of pauses and glances, of honest dialogue, unburdened by unrealistic expectations. Isabel wasn't sure when she first started to like him, but she knew there was something different there. Something that didn't burn like passion, but warmed like a home. They weren't in love yet, maybe never even, but they were present. And that, now, was more valuable than any promise of eternal love. He respected her. And she, for the first time in years, allowed herself to be respected without fear. Meanwhile, in another corner of the country, Thomas lived in peace. The house he built was already finished, surrounded by greenery, silence, and simplicity. Mornings were filled with quiet coffees on the porch, walks with the dog, and sincere conversations with the woman who welcomed him without having to rebuild him. With her, he didn't need to prove anything. He was loved for who he was, with his scars, his fears, his silences. His new partner understood his past and, instead of competing with the memories, helped him transform them into learning experiences. Thomas moved on with dignity, not out of revenge, but because he knew how to respect himself during the most painful moment in his life. He never saw Isabel again. He never read her messages again. But he kept her last letter in a sealed envelope, tucked away in a box alongside other memories. Not out of resentment, but as a reminder, sometimes loving someone isn't enough, you have to be loved just as deeply. Laura, for her part, took a more solitary path. After her definitive breakup with Isabel, she spent time immersed in her own silence. Her friend's betrayal wasn't just a breach of romantic trust, but a deep wound that questioned everything she had built throughout her life. She felt used, betrayed on multiple levels. Over time, she understood that Isabel wasn't evil, but weak. And this weakness destroyed bonds that would never be mended. She decided to move to another city, to start her life over somewhere else, far from the ghosts of a past she didn't want to carry. She worked hard, made new friends, and began writing a book about human relationships, incorporating everything she learned about love, loss, and new beginnings. She never sought out Isabel again, never spoke to Thomas again. But she carried within her the peace of someone who moved on with dignity, even when everything screamed for revenge. And what of the man who caused the silent collapse of so many lives? His trial took place months after the scandal broke. During the proceedings, other betrayals, other lies, other crimes came to light. He was a skilled manipulator, someone who wore smiles like armor and used the fragility of others as fuel. He was sentenced to years in prison. And there, behind bars, he lost what he valued most, the freedom to manipulate. For Isabel, this news brought no relief, only a cruel reinforcement of the blindness she had lived in. She felt no pleasure in his downfall, she felt shame. Shame for having exchanged everything real for a distorted reflection. The lesson had been taught. The price had been high. But lucidity, now, was non-negotiable. One day, while reviewing a literature paper by one of her more sensitive students, Isabel came across an essay about invisible losses. The girl wrote about how sometimes we lose someone who is still alive and we continue to hear that person's voice within us, even if they never return. Isabel felt her eyes well up. That teenager described exactly what she had felt since the end. She had lost Thomas in body, but most importantly in soul. She had lost herself for a time. But there, in that room, surrounded by attentive students, she realized she could still make a difference. That there was still room to blossom. And that was enough. On a bright Sunday morning, sitting on a bench in a park where flowers were just beginning to bloom, Isabel received a message from Miguel: "I'm going to that trail we talked about. If you want to come, I'll be waiting for you at the park entrance." She looked at her phone for a few seconds, took a deep breath, and smiled. She stood up, grabbed her bag, and walked toward the possible. She knew that love, now, didn't have to be euphoric or cinematic. It just needed to be honest. And perhaps she was about to discover a new way of loving, quieter, more mature, more conscious. Each character followed their own path, bearing the consequences of their own decisions. There was no miraculous redemption, nor cinematic punishments. There was reality. There was transformation. And, above all, there was learning. Because life doesn't just revolve to punish, it revolves to teach. And this story, which began with a silent betrayal in a random restaurant, ended with a clear lesson: when you break the trust of someone who truly loves you, you don't just lose the other person, you lose the most beautiful reflection of yourself. And this loss, unlike others, isn't mended with time. It's simply carried. Now I want to know, what did you think of this story? What was the moment that impacted you the most? Let me know in the comments, your opinion is very important. If this story touched you in any way, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and activate the bell to receive the next dramatic stories that always bring a profound lesson. And remember, betrayal destroys homes, corrupts feelings and erases beautiful stories before they even reach their end. Cheating isn't just making a mistake, it's abandoning everything someone gave you with an open heart. This channel does not support, encourage, or romanticize any kind of betrayal. Here, the truth is told with emotion, and the consequences are always real. Until the next story.